So when the Israelites first left Egypt, they were all pumped to get to this new place that God had promised, and they're out there and they're going, but after a while they're kind of getting tired, and like it's been several dozen years. And so finally Aaron goes to Moses and is like, Moses, when are we going to get there? Are we there yet? And Moses looks confused for a minute and kind of looks around and gestures, and he says, what are you talking about? We're already here. This is the promised sand. Hello everybody, my name is Austin, and this is our journey through Scripture. Today we are talking about the fourth book of the Bible, Numbers. In Hebrew, this book is known as Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, which is where this whole book takes place. In the wilderness between Mount Sinai and the Promised Land. In English, this book is called Numbers because in it, Moses takes two censuses, or censai, or censuses. He counts up the people of Israel twice. Just like the other books we've looked at so far, we can break up the book of Numbers into a couple of different chunks, this time based on location. Chapter 1 through chapter 10, verse 10, is all about the Israelites getting ready to leave Mount Sinai. The second half of chapter 10 through chapter 21 tells this constantly repeating cycle of the people complaining about things and how rough things are and God getting mad about it. The third part of the book runs from chapter 22 to the end of the book, chapter 36, and it takes place right at the edge of the Promised Land, right as everybody's getting ready to go in. When we last were with the Israelites, they were at the foot of Mount Sinai receiving laws from God via Moses about what they were supposed to do and what they were not supposed to do, and some of those laws were kind of rough. And so if you haven't had a chance to go back and take a look at last week's video on Leviticus, you should do that now, because we're going to talk about some more rough stuff, and it's going to be relevant. I'm going to go through the stories we hear in this book first, and then we're going to kind of talk about the main themes and how we think about that rough stuff afterwards. The book of Numbers starts with Moses taking a census of all the men over age 20 in every tribe, except the Levites. The Levites get counted separately because they're the priests. But essentially what they're trying to do is take a census of the people that can fight. Moses gives everybody a few final laws before they start out, including a really terrible one in which a man who feels jealous about his wife can take his wife to the priest and essentially have her cursed just in case she cheated, so that's a bummer. Finally, though, the people celebrate their first Passover since leaving Egypt, and it's wonderful, and with that last big celebration, they head out. Enter part 2. The minute the people leave and go into the wilderness with Moses, they start complaining immediately. They start talking about how they're sick of the manna, this miracle bread that God has been raining down on them. They're sick of it. They don't want it anymore. Moses goes and tells God about all this complaining, and God gets mad, and so God sends them a bunch of quail so they have something else to eat, but God also sends a plague because they complained. So little this, little that. At one point, Aaron and Miriam, Moses' siblings, get kind of jealous of him and basically say, we're just as good at leading as Moses is. And God basically says, no, you're not, and then curses Miriam with leprosy, but Aaron gets away scot-free for some reason. Then we get to chapters 13 and 14, which are hugely important ones. Moses decides to send some spies into the land, one from each tribe, to kind of go see what the promised land looks like, what kind of resources are there, what kind of people are there. So he sends these guys out, and they kind of check around, and they come back. And two of the people that come back, Caleb and Joshua, basically say, hey, the land is full of these great resources. There are people there, but like God has promised us this land, so we should go for it. All the other spies, except for Caleb and Joshua, say the land is full of tons of people with high-walled cities. They're giants. It's like there's no way. We're going to be crushed. If we go in there and try to militarily conquer this place, we're going to be crushed. The Israelites freak out about this whole giants and walled cities thing, and they decide they're going to elect a new leader to take them back to Egypt. God gets mad about the people's lack of trust in God and in Moses' leadership, and God is about to, it's going to be a whole golden calf thing all over again. God's going to just destroy the people of Israel completely. But then, again, just like with the golden calf, Moses butts in and is like, God, wait, stop, don't do it. Let's figure out another way around this. God eventually comes around and says, okay, cool, I won't destroy everybody. I'm sorry, I freaked out. So instead, the people who were born in slavery in Egypt, these people who have been complaining and not trusting in God, they're not going to be able to go into the promised land. This old generation isn't going to be able to go in. But the new generation of people who have been born in the wilderness and born since leaving Egypt, they're going to be the ones that will inherit the promised land. There are two exceptions to this, and those exceptions are Caleb and Joshua, the two brave spies. So here's where I want to properly introduce you to our Queero of the Week, Joshua. We've actually been hearing about Joshua for a while now. We heard about him a lot back in Exodus. This is another example of the Bible telling stories from different perspectives, and sometimes they seem like they conflict a little bit. For instance, in Exodus, Joshua comes on the scene as Moses' right-hand guy in a battle on the way to Sinai. In Numbers, though, Joshua isn't properly introduced until way after Sinai, when the people are getting ready to go into the Promised Land and when Moses sends Joshua out as one of the spies. Chapter 13, verse 8 tells us that a man named Hoshea, son of Nun, was one of the spies sent out to case the joint. A couple of verses later, in verse 16, we read, Moses changed the name of Hoshea, son of Nun, to Joshua. The reason I picked Joshua for our Queero this week is specifically because of this interesting name change. If you're a trans person, you may have experienced or decided on a name change in your lifetime, and so I'm always interested when I find biblical characters whose names are changed. I'm interested to know why that change happened and what it means. In Joshua's case, scholars think that Moses might have changed his name specifically to signify this sort of new identity in the community, from just another person to a future leader. Joshua's birth name, Hoshea, means salvation in Hebrew, and what Moses did to change his name was he just added one specific Hebrew letter to the beginning of Hoshea's name. Moses added the letter Yod, which is kind of like an upside-down comma in the air in Hebrew. It makes a Y sound. Why this one letter? Well, because Yod is the first letter of God's name as revealed to Moses in the burning bush incident. When Moses says, "Who shall I say sent me?" When he's talking to the burning bush, God says this name, which we can't pronounce. It's made up of three Hebrew letters. One is doubled, but it's the letters Yod, He, Vav, He. We don't know how to pronounce this name for a bunch of different reasons, one of which is that ancient Hebrew doesn't have vowels, so we have to figure that out. One of the ways that English speakers have tried to pronounce this name over the years, though, is Yahweh. So when Moses adds that one little yod to the beginning of Hoshea's name, it becomes Yahoshea, or Yahshua, or Joshua. That changes the meaning of Hoshea's name from just salvation to God saves. Pretty cool, right? Okay, that concludes our nerdy Hebrew lesson for the week. So, back to the larger story. This same cycle we've been seeing for a couple chapters now just keeps happening. God gives some kind of law, and the people either break the law or complain, and God gets mad, and God punishes them, and the people repent, and it happens over and over, and wash, rinse, repeat. In chapter 20, we have another game changer. This time, the people are complaining about how there's no water to drink, which is like a legitimate response. And so Moses goes to God and says, "What should I do?" God says to Moses, "Take your staff and go hit that rock over there, and water will come out of it for everybody to drink." So Moses goes over with his staff and basically says, "You want water? I'll give you water," and hits the stone, and water comes out. But God gets mad at Moses because apparently in the way that Moses talked about the incident, it made it seem like Moses was making the water happen, and God got mad that God wasn't getting the full glory out of this thing. In response to that, God says Moses will not be allowed to enter the Promised Land either. That sucks so much, and we're going to talk about how Moses might have felt about that in next week's video on Deuteronomy. So that's part 2. On to part 3, the last part. In this last section, a nearby king tries to curse the people of Israel, but end up getting blessed by a prophet instead, so that's some good news for once. Finally, we get to the stories of this new generation in chapter 26. This is the new generation of people who have been born free and kind of have a different outlook on the world. Moses takes a second census. Turns out all the people from the old generation have died off. It's just the new generation and Joshua and Caleb and Moses now, and Moses isn't going to be allowed in, so that's where we are, standing on the edge of the Promised Land. Moses decides to conduct some last-minute business, so he officially makes Joshua the next successor, the next leader of Israel. He creates some laws about inheritance and who can inherit what, and it turns out that women can be allowed to inherit the land of their fathers if they have no brothers, which is cool. And there are some details about sacrifices and offerings and which land each tribe is going to get once they go in. The last story from this book that I want to highlight happens in chapter 31. Here God tells the people of Israel through Moses that they should fight the Midianites, who at one point had tried to convert them to worshiping another god. Moses basically tells the army commanders what to do. They go out, they kill all the Midianite men, and they bring back the women and children as spoils of war, basically. But then, when the military leaders get back and Moses sees that they've brought back the women and children, Moses is mad. He basically says, you know what, that's not enough. You also have to kill all the male children and any of the women who have ever slept with a man. The new head priest, Eleazar, then tells all the military personnel how to purify themselves after this terrible thing. So there are two parts of this story that I want to lift up that I think are really interesting. The first is that this new generation of Israelites, their instinct is not to go in and literally kill everybody like the old generation did. They only go in and seem to kill the people that were actually fighting. They spare the women and children. Moses, one of the old generation, though, is not satisfied with this. We're not told that Moses was told by God to kill these male children and the women. Moses just thinks that's what's supposed to happen. The second thing that's interesting about this story is that we don't actually know if the military leaders went through with it. There's a numbering or a counting of women who had not slept with men later on in the chapter, but there's never anything that says whether or not the military leaders were like, okay, guess we got to kill these kids. What that says to me is that there's some kind of ideological difference here between the people who were born free and had not experienced the tyranny of Egypt and the people of the old guard who had, and who therefore may have put some of those expectations of tyranny on God. And that's where I find hope in this book that's full of so many dark things. I find hope in the fact that sometimes it takes new eyes to be able to see God differently. Now, I'm not saying that the Israelites somehow immediately get it after this. They definitely screw up a lot, and we're going to read about that. But there's some difference in the way that the people who have not experienced trauma relate to God versus the people who have. Now, I don't mean to downplay or demonize trauma in any way, but I think that the people of Israel who experienced really awful leadership under Pharaoh and had experienced slavery, like we talked about last week, expected that same sort of tyranny from God. And so it took this new generation who had not experienced that to see God in a different way. The young people with a new perspective might have something really cool to bring to the table. And of course, that's how I see those of us in the LGBTQ plus community as well. I think we're bringing something to the larger Christian table that nobody else can. And I think just like these new generation of Israelites, we might be leaning a little bit more towards loving our neighbor rather than killing our neighbor. I'll be honest with you here, Numbers is my least favorite book of the Old Testament. It is full of patriarchy and genocide and generally what people think of as the angry Old Testament God. And honestly, if Numbers were the only book in the Bible, I would not blame you one bit. God is kind of a dick in this book. And I don't think it's bad to call out the human rights violations we see in these old stories because they're wrong. They're just wrong. And the fact that people maybe thought this was what God wanted doesn't make them right. We know that even if we believe these stories to be God-inspired, they were still lived out and written down by humans who tend to screw things up and who tend to mishear things and let their own desires get in the way. But the good news is that Numbers is not the only book in the Bible. We have a whole larger canon in which to see this larger arc of history and scripture. It's not just this one little snapshot. We have so many stories of people hearing God calling not for genocide, but for justice, not for discrimination, but for equality. Part of reading the Bible in this series is recognizing that none of these books stands on its own. It's part of this larger narrative. Next week, we're going to be exploring Deuteronomy, which is the last of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's known as Moses' farewell address. There are some really poetic moments and moments that sum up all the good things that the Israelites have learned throughout this whole journey, and I'm really excited to share those with you. In the meantime, many thanks to my patrons over at the Patreon, including Ben and TK and Cora. You all are awesome, and if you want to join our little group, you can join one of the chat groups that we have set up. There are all kinds of cool perks, so check it out at patreon.com/AustinLionheart, and I'll put a link down below as well. I'll see you there soon, and I'll see you back here next Wednesday when we talk about Deuteronomy. Thanks for being here, everybody, and keep reading.